Okay. Welcome to our last webinar of the academic year featuring Dr. Jennifer Ervin. My name is Hande Fenerci, and I'm a doctoral student at Virginia Tech and the senior graduate student representative for the Complexity Theories in Education SIG. Today, we welcome Dr. Jennifer Ervin. She's an assistant professor of English education at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Her research explores the intersection between policies and asset-based pedagogies in secondary English language art classrooms. Dr. Irwin will deliver her presentation with an opportunity for a question and answer session at the end of her presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Irwin as she discusses using complexity theory to visually map and code qualitative data.
All right. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks so much to the Complexity SIG for having me. I love the opportunity to nerd out with other people about things like coding and like talking about methods and all that kind of fun, particular stuff that most people don't want to hear anything about. So I love the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. I'll share my screen in a minute, but I just wanted to let you know I dropped the link to my slides in the chat. If I've done the tech right, you should be able to look at my slides that way. If that's helpful for you to have those on your own screen, I did include like 3 slides at the end that have a ton of references to anyone that I cite in the slides, plus a bunch of other scholarship that I've used for my work in complexity theory. So that just to kind of help situate like the perspective that I'm coming in with. Yeah, just so you have it. So if that doesn't work for any reason, let me know. And then I think my email's in this slideshow, but if not, I'll drop it in the chat as well if anyone wants to follow up about anything, or even just talk about, thanks, Sunday. Talk about complexity theory. I'm always here for it. Okay, let me get sharing. I'll also just want to say I've been really appreciated. I haven't been able to attend these webinars because they've kind of conflicted with my teaching schedule, unfortunately. But I have been able to go back through the YouTube channel and watch the presentations that have been done so far, and I really appreciated those so much. It's really been super informative and eye-opening to see some of the ways that people are using complexity theory, especially in scholarship that's totally different from mine. So it's been really helpful to kind of learn from the work that you all are doing too. Um, okay, I think I have my slideshow up. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, fantastic. So basically, so again, I know Hani introduced me already, but my name is Jennifer Ervin. I'm an assistant professor of English Ed at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and I'm just going to talk about how I use this theory, complexity theory, to code qualitative data that I did in a narrative inquiry on teachers' experiences with the socio-political context in Georgia. And I'll get into some of the background on that study a little bit more, but I'm going to try to really zoom in on how I use complexity theory to code that data. Um, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the coding, I'll just I know that probably everyone here is super familiar with complexity theory, but just in case if not, just a kind of quick overview of how I understand it, is that, it's a way to analyze systems and the operation of learning and evolution of those systems by looking at them as a complete whole. The system being one that you cannot deconstruct and reconstruct and have it operate in the same way. So thinking about the interactions between phenomena within the sister and the communicative activities that come up through those interactions. Um, this has been applied to education and educational research by many scholars, but I've got some citations here to some of the scholarship that I personally have drawn on. Mostly, I'm drawing on Davis and Sumara's 2006 text, but I also have some other articles here that have been particularly informative for me, including work by Cochran Smith, Barthen Dismuke, McQuitty, Upfer and Petter, and how I'm kind of coming to complexity theory. Um, Thinking about complex systems. So, sometimes when I'm trying to talk about this work with people who are not working with complexity theory, I kind of try to explain these as systems that are, they're not linear, they do not operate in predictable or predetermined ways. Instead, they are emergent, meaning they take on new meaning and character through the interactions and communicative pathways that develop among the phenomena in the system. So the way that I kind of will explain this to someone who maybe is working from a different perspective is I'll kind of compare it to, for example, like a watch. If you have a watch and you take that watch apart, each of the components of that watch has its own unique function. And yet when you put those pieces together, typically, if you've done it the right way, that watch will still work in a predetermined way based on the interactions between those components of the watch. Whereas, and I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but someone in the one of the many books I've read on this does talk about the blueprint for a neighborhood or blueprint for a city. If you have a neighborhood, you might have identical suburban neighborhoods that are all designed in the same way with the same sorts of houses and the same sorts of street layout. And yet that neighborhood is a complex system because the interactions within that neighborhood are going to vary greatly depending on the way that the individuals within that neighborhood interact with one another. So that's kind of a way that I try to map out the difference between complex systems and complicated systems. Um, so I do studies in policy implementation in particular with secondary teachers. And I found this to be a really, really great way to think about the way that policies are understood and implemented in particular teaching contexts. The idea that policy implementation is variable and complex dependent is actually pretty well established in the field of policy implementation and studies. And so I think that complexity theory really maps on well to that, and that the systems that teachers exist within are going to inevitably influence the way that they understand policy, the way that they enact policy, the way that they take it up, because that policy is sort of integrated into their system and just becomes one of many variables within the system of their own teaching. And so thinking also, about complexity theory and teachers' practices, this is a way to explain or understand that no phenomena on its own is going to account for the way that a teacher's personal pedagogical approach will develop over time. Instead, it's about that in the interacting phenomena that are at work within the teacher's system, including their own goals for their teaching, the classrooms, their students in those classrooms, and then the multiple other sort of social or personal or professional systems that their work is enacted within. And part of also what I study is teacher development, and I think that this has been a really fruitful way to think about how teachers develop, particularly in their movement from methods courses at the university into student teaching into their professional careers, and that it really problematizes this linear cause and effect mentality and thinking about putting theory into practice as if that's a straight line, because it kind of demonstrates that the desire for best practices and what works well in one context is not always going to work well in other contexts because there are so many different variables that are within those different contexts. And that's kind of a quote from Davis and Samara's work. Um, I should also say I do have like at least 15 minutes mapped onto the end here for questions. So if you have questions that are coming up as I'm talking through how I'm understanding some of these concepts, we should have plenty of time to get to them at the end. I'll just run through everything first and then we can chat. I wanted to name some of the key concepts that I have drawn on from complexity theory in my own research and just dig into them a little bit more. One of those concepts from complexity theory that I work with a lot is this idea of emergence, right? And the idea that, new properties and behaviors are merged that might not be contained within the essence of the constituent phenomena or the constituent elements, and that are basically unpredictable because they emerge based on the interactions within individual systems and that those interactions are unique. Another concept that I've worked with a lot of my research or thought about a lot through some of my research is this idea of fit and thinking about how components of a system will adapt to new input in a way that creates minimal disruption to the existing arrangement of the system, and thinking about the path dependence of variables develop over time. So, how there might be a variable that is most likely to follow its trajectory that it's been following, even if that becomes less efficient because of the inertia among those variables. what I use that to understand is how teachers who might be trying to implement a new policy or respond to a new a new element in the socio-political context are really trying to work those new requirements or policy demands or legislative context into the existing pedagogies that they are already habituated to and that they are already, in the habit of working with, because they're not going to be likely to just like implement a new policy, in a way that really interrupts their teaching style or their teaching beliefs or their teaching goals. And so for them, it's about finding a workable fit between the elements of their own system and their own goals and the ways they're already working and that new legislative context or that new policy demand. Another concept that has been really helpful here, sorry, I just think I just went backwards. There we go, is nested systems. And this is the one that comes up, this is the one that I really leaned into when I was doing coding, and I'll show you kind of some visuals of what that looked like for me in a few slides here. But just the idea of nested systems being that the components of complex system are also often complex systems themselves with self-similar analogous traits or functions, but operating at a different scale or level of analysis. And also the understanding that the boundaries, I think it's important to name that the boundaries between different nested systems are ambiguous, they're open, they're in a continual exchange of information with any other, and therefore the judgments about where one system is bounded or where one system ends and another one begins is actually really just a judgment on the researcher, on the person analyzing those systems, and it really is only a way to sort of name and contain and focus an analysis. So I'll talk about how I see nested systems in my work here in a minute, but that's kind of the background explanation on what that means. So thinking about teaching as an individual activity that's influenced by a teacher's personal ideology, I think about that as nested within their classroom system that incorporates the students themselves, the learning goals of the classroom, the interests of the students, and how that exists within a professional context of the school or the district that might include curricular standards, routines for learning or demands on teachers, sort of requirements for them. And all of that is going to exist within a larger district system, within a larger state system, within a larger federal system, within the community, within the socio-political context, and how all those systems are sort of nested within one another. And the influence among these systems is recursive. So it's not that one system will influence another one in a unidirectional way, it's bidirectional, right? And so an individual teacher's ideology or their personal goals for teaching might be changed by expectations or requirements at the school or classroom level, but in turn, an individual teacher's ideology or pedagogy can then influence a classroom dynamic or a school's operation. And so thinking about the bidirectional flow of those influences among teaching classrooms, schools, school districts, and on and on. This is a concept that Davis and Simt in their work on disciplinary knowledge kind of used to explain how disciplinary, not specific knowledge is subjective and how it's nested within a classroom collectivity, nested within curriculum, nested within intersubjective knowledge. And so I kind of took that image that they have in their work and used it to think about how teaching and teachers' pedagogy is nested within their classroom, within their institutional context, within the socio-political context. So this is the image I used when I first started kind of getting into this research. Since this, I've worked on another project. The first author on this other project is Katie Strom, and we have a publication with a few other colleagues of ours that's in press. And I'll just share that if Katie Strom created an image that's similar to this, but it really demonstrates the flow with some arrows and things in a much clearer way. That paper is in press. But if that's an image that you would want, just send me an email. I'll find a way to share it with you, especially once it's published. This one doesn't really show the flow of information as well, but it is just kind of demonstrates how I'm thinking about nested systems in my work. So those are the concepts from complexity theory that I'm thinking with. I'm going to share sort of the background on my research context here, and then get into how I used complexity theory for coding, and then the findings that it led me to. Um, this is from my dissertation research, and I've got a couple papers out related to this work. But basically, it's a narrative inquiry into how justice and equity-oriented teachers are understanding their work within the socio-political context at the time, which was in Georgia in 2023. I'm in Wisconsin right now, but this is where I did my research, was in Georgia a couple years ago. My research questions were, what were teachers' narratives telling us about how teachers who are committed to justice and equity-oriented pedagogies were experiencing the sociopolitical climate, and how can a complexity lens help us to understand the impact that that climate was having on teachers and those commitments? So just briefly, the legislative sort of policy context in Georgia was that in 2022, they passed three acts of legislation. This is very similar to legislation that many, many, many other states have passed at this point, along the lines of like divisive concepts legislation, anti-CRT laws, legislation related to book bans and curricular censorship. Georgia's legislation, they had these three acts that basically created a formalized process for parents to review curricula, complain about curricula if they had an issue with it, and then also a piece of legislation naming the ways that teachers should and should not discuss race and racial identities specifically. And so what I did is I did a narrative inquiry with 7 secondary ELA teachers. They worked in 6 different districts because my goal was to get different perspectives from sort of rural, suburban, urban areas. And I did rounds of interviews and observations to try to discover, where those commitments came from, but also how they were feeling impacted by the socio-political context. So that's the background. In terms of coding, complexity theory was not the first lens that I applied in my coding system. So some of my first phases of coding were just, a general primary cycle of open coding, looking for common themes. And then I inputted my data into the qualitative coding software MaxQDA. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that, but it's, one of many computer-assisted qualitative data systems that's out there. And I'll show you what some of that looked like in a second. After I had it in MaxQDA, I went through and coded again through a process of reflexive thematic analysis, and narrative inquiry has its own sort of guidelines for coding, so I use that as well. I came up with 131 codes. It's a lot of codes. I had a lot of data. It was a little overwhelming at first. And then I went through a process of writing very long participant profiles and sending those to the participants for member checking. But then, after all of that, I returned to the data using this concept of nested systems as an analytical frame for my data. And I started to organize my codes within the categories of teachers' personal systems, their classroom systems, their institutional systems, and their socio-political systems. And that process really helped me to organize and then collapse my codes into broader categories. After that process, I ended up with 67 codes, much more manageable number. And it really helped me to see and think about how, if I'm trying to uncover ways that teachers' personal pedagogical commitments to justice and equity are interacting with this broader socio-political legislative context in Georgia, to think about the ways that influences are moving in between these various systemic levels, in between teachers' personal ideologies and the broader socio-political scene. It just helped me to kind of visualize those interacting influences. So what I started with, and if you're familiar with MaxQDA, they have a lot of visual coding mapping tools. That have been really helpful for this. And I don't think that MaxQDA is the only way to do this at all. I think there are other qualitative, programs that can do this. I think you can also just do this with paper and highlighters and index cards. I don't think you even necessarily need computer-assisted software to do this, but I'd love to hear ideas from y'all after I'm done presenting, if anyone has any other suggestions about other programs that would work well for this. But in MaxQDA, they've got a bunch of visual mapping tools, and you can kind of start with a blank canvas. And that's what I did. I started with this blank, just white screen in the program, and I inputted all 67 of my codes, and I just sort of started moving them around and started thinking about what are the connections between these various themes? What are the connections between these various ideas? How did this idea over here lead to this idea over here, lead to this idea over there? What are the lines of influence in between them? And I sort of started moving them around and thinking about them in that way. Then I kind of came around to, well, what if I kind of put them in the nested systems that I believe they exist within in terms of thinking about influences as, is this influence on a teacher's pedagogy and teaching coming from their own personal goals, their personal ideology, their personal history, their life story? Or is it maybe coming from an influence within their classroom, from their students? Is it coming from something at their school level or from their school level administration or from their district, or is it coming from the broader socio-political context and or the community outside of their school? And so I sort of started to map the codes into those different systems and eventually ended up with this map, which is, sort of thinking about, I know this is impossible to read, but, the inner circle is teachers' personal systems, then it's the classroom system, then their institutional system, and then the broader socio-political system. And I sort of started to map codes visually into this nested system of spheres to understand where these different influences are coming from and how they're interacting with one another. And what this really helped me to see was visually that so many of teachers' influences were actually coming from their own sort of personal impressions of the socio-political system or their own personal goals, and the role that that played in their teaching. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. Um, This is another stage of my coding. This kind of shows you like some of the messy ways I was going about this. In this picture on the right-hand side, I've got those nested spheres that I was working with in MaxQDA. On the smaller screen, I actually just have Word docs of all of my interview data that I went through and coded with a highlighter in Word to sort of see how those different influences in teachers' interviews were showing up and relating to the different systems of their work. And then I also wrote all my codes out along with some notes on them on index cards and spent a lot of time with a lot of colored index cards on the floor, just sort of moving them around in different organizations and trying to understand how different influences were connected and how they were interacting. I also had to, publish this in my dissertation, so I had to think about how to put it in a way that was readable for my committee and a little bit more, publication friendly. So I put it also in a table, which I think doesn't demonstrate the interactions as clearly, but it helped just, visually on paper to have it in a table as well. So ways that I think that this coding process really helped me to narrow down some of my findings and understandings. One is that, it really helped me to understand the movement of influences and being able to like literally move codes around among different systems and thinking about how different codes interacted and built on one another, influenced one another, really helped me to think about the flow of information and influence among the systems of teachers' work. So thinking about that flow through the movement of codes was a really helpful thought process, a really helpful analytical process. The other thing that I found super helpful was just the visual, being able to visualize how these different influences were interacting really helped me to condense and focus on different sort of systemic levels of influence in teachers' work, especially because I found that most of the codes when I went into the project, I thought that possibly the socio-political context, including the legislation in Georgia, was going to be having a sort of major impact on the work of these teachers who were committed to, justice-based teaching, equity-based teaching, or even just simply teaching in ways that was culturally responsive and discussing issues of race and racism. I thought that the socio-political impact was going to be pretty large. And yet when I kind of looked at my codes, I'm going to flip back here for just a sec. I really was able to see that most of the influences teachers were experiencing were actually more internal. We're actually coming from more emotional responses from their own goals, from their own personal histories, their own experiences with schooling in the past. And I was able to really see that through mapping these codes into these different systems. And it was an unexpected finding for me. So those those are the main ways that I think this process of coding with complexity theory really helped me. I also want to just share real briefly a couple individual teachers' narratives that I think really demonstrate the interaction of a lot of various influences on teachers' teaching and their systems. So I'll just tell two stories here and kind of talk about how I see them through complexity theory. One teacher that I'll call Emma, she had a parent complain about her teaching the book Trevor Noah's Born a Crime because it deals pretty directly with race and racism. And Emma was teaching in a fairly conservative, more rural school district, and she had a parent complaint say that she shouldn't teach it anymore. So I kind of thought about how, it was a result of the social and political forces at the time that the parent even felt that it was acceptable to call the school and complain about this book that was an established part of the school's formal curriculum. The administration at Emma's school actually really did not agree with the Georgia legislation. They thought that it was not something that teachers should respond to. And so they didn't even let the parent talk to Emma. And they never told Emma that this parent had complained about this book. They tried to fully shield her from this parent complaint. The parent was frustrated with that response, and so then they took it to the school board. And again, I see this as a result of the socio-political, context of the time, especially the media, and that school board meetings were pretty highlighted in the media during that time. This is 2023. The school board at that meeting dismissed the complaint completely, and in that way, sort of established a sort of formalized policy response at their district level to complaints of this nature against a book just because it deals with race and racism. The school board said that's not a reason that this teacher should not be teaching this book. We're going to dismiss this complaint. And so again, it sort of became a formalized response in a district that previously had not had a formalized response to this legislation. While all that was going on, Emma did not know it. And later she heard about the situation from a colleague, and she still was not sure whether or not she should teach Trevor Noah's Born a Crime again. And she said it was because she was just worried that something like that would happen again. To me, that was incredibly telling because, her admin had not let her get the complaint because they were supportive of her. Her admin had, knew that she was teaching this book and wanted her to keep teaching it. Even the school board had dismissed the complaint. And so, despite all these sort of levels of administrative support and intervention, she still felt really uncomfortable. But by the fact that even a parent had even noticed and taken the time to complain about it and considered not teaching it again. Now, she did end up teaching it again eventually, but it was because of a long conversation with some of her colleagues and because of her personal love for the book that she did end up deciding to teach it again. So I really appreciate that narrative because to me, it really demonstrates how their influence is coming from so many different levels of that system, including Emma's love for this book, her colleagues' support, her district support, her admin support, and that still, even in the center of that system, Emma still feels very uncomfortable with the idea that someone complained about a book she was teaching. So it kind of just shows, I think, the nested ways that those influences are interacting among those systems. Um, Another example came from a teacher named Kathy, who again taught in a pretty rural, very small district in Georgia. Kathy was a veteran teacher. She'd been teaching for 30 years. She had taught the principal at her school as a student, so she was very established within her school community. And then the broader community, she talked about things like going to church with some of the families of students in her community and going to do things at the community center. Like she was just a very community engaged person, and it was a very small community. She talked about how her district level administrators, the assistant superintendent specifically, had a meeting for all teachers after this legislation in Georgia had passed to tell them directly that none of them were doing anything against the legislation and that none of them should make any curricular changes in response to it. So she had a lot of administrative response, a very clear administrative policy response, a very clear administrative support. And yet, Kathy still felt very hesitant and very aware of the topics she was teaching. She was very mindful and careful about this idea of like quote unquote indoctrinating students. Even as someone who purported to really engage with culturally responsive education and who I really saw engage in culturally responsive ways with her students in my observations with her. She told a story about how a newer teacher wanted to teach some book, and I don't even think she named the book, but she kind of suggested to this newer teacher, like, if you teach that book, you should expect some community members to push back and kind of gently discourage the new teacher from teaching a book that in some way engaged with some topics that might have been seen as controversial in that community. So again, this was just a demonstration to me of the influence between Kathy and her colleagues, that even though Kathy had this very supportive and directly, this administrative response that was directly dismissive of the sociopolitical legislative changes in Georgia, that just those interactions between Kathy and her colleagues actually had a greater influence on what was being taught in that context. Um, okay, so I'm just going to kind of zoom out here and talk a little bit about how this process of coding and analysis led to some of my findings. Again, thinking about how the import of teachers' personal systems and their own personal felt emotional responses to the sociopolitical context had a really big impact on their work. I ended up kind of, as my findings, writing about how their sense of anxiety and worry and fear existed regardless of whether or not they had experienced consequences to their work, or regardless of whether or not they had supportive administrators who told them they didn't need to respond to the legislative context, and how they also felt super visible, like hyper visible, like a spotlight was placed on them, especially if they openly had goals for being culturally responsive or equity-minded educators. They felt that that made them even more visible within the socio-political context. And again, this was regardless of whether they had actually experienced a complaint or pushback from admin or anything along those lines. And so often what I found that resulting in, unfortunately, was self-censorship. Teachers being extra careful about the decisions that they made, the books that they taught, avoiding conversations at times if they felt it could lead to pushback, um, putting it on the students to start conversations that might be potentially controversial rather than initiating those conversations themselves, and just sort of self-censoring in the sense of being really careful and mindful of what they were teaching, and in some cases, avoiding certain books, certain topics, things like that. I also, found that this sense of fit between systems was really a necessary element in order for teachers to feel that their work was sustainable. Um, I found this, I wrote about this because of the teachers I interviewed seven. Six of them, actually all seven of them talked about either leaving a school, like having left a school recently for their current job, or planning to leave their current job at the end of the school year that we were doing interviews, or both. Um, and so I kind of used that to understand how teachers needed to find a workable sense of fit between the various systems of their work, and especially in including their personal sense of pedagogy and their personal goals as a teacher, and how that fit within their institutions and within the socio-political context. Um, and how their practices were emergent as they tried to make those adaptations, and yet they were not always successful. And so when they were not able to sort of meet their pedagogical goals or find that sense of fit, I found that teachers would either adapt their own practices in some case, like make small changes to their pedagogy to try to fit whatever was being demanded of them in another system, or in some cases, teachers were challenging their institutions or their colleagues to adapt to their own personal pedagogical preferences, or and sort of eliminate some policies, and some requirements so that they were able to teach the way that they wanted to teach. Or in some cases, one teacher was kind of like, I just shut my door and do my thing. Like I tell them that I'm doing the thing that they want me to do, but I'm not really doing the thing. I'm just doing it superficially, and kind of being a little bit more subversive, I guess, with teaching in the way that they wanted to. Um, and then, like I said before, leaving their professional context. I had several teachers who were planning to quit in the year that we were doing interviews, which with a group of seven seemed pretty significant. So I kind of wrote about how when teachers were not able to find a sustainable sense of fit between these different systems of their work and the demands that were coming from these different systems, they often just left their job and tried to find a different teaching context. The only outlier was Kathy. She also talked about quitting, but for her it was retirement, and she had been teaching for 30 years. So it really wasn't she actually, I mean, she really emphasizes this theme even more because she had a really clear sense of fit between the different systemic levels of her work. She felt like her personal goals fit within her institution, which fit within the broader community context she was working within. She felt very comfortable that she could sort of teach in the way that she wanted to, even though she did feel like she had to be mindful sometimes and careful sometimes. And so she was happy to be working where she was, and was just planning to retire soon. Um, So, all of this to say, I think that, I've got just a few more slides here. In terms of implications, I think that the systems-based perspective that complexity theory offers really helped me to see the interactions of influence, the ways that systems were nested within one another, and, to not just try to take a linear approach. And that demonstrated that the way that policies and legislation are integrated, it really depends on the context, right? And it is there, those policies and acts of legislation are integrated among, such an uncountable number of other phenomena and influence that there's really no way to predict how they're going to be taken up in different contexts. Which again is pretty well understood concept in the field of policy implementation. But I do think about, if I had approached this in a different way, some of these understandings I don't think I would have really quite gotten to them. I think that complexity theory really helped me to visualize how policy implementation is context dependent and how it's very variable. I think it really helped me to understand that it's impossible to predict or plan for a uniform implementation, and that maybe that's not something that should be a goal because it's just not going to happen. And I also think, most importantly, I think it really helped bring focus to other phenomena within different systems that may seem inconsequential, but that actually are very consequential within different systems. And this is something that complexity theorists write about. I think there's several that use this metaphor of grains of sand on a pyramid, and once one grain of sand gets on the pyramid, the whole pyramid collapses. Like, really thinking about those really minor tangential things that you just don't even expect to influence a situation at all, and actually how they have like a huge impact. And I think complexity theory really brings attention to that in an important way. Um, so just looking ahead, I'm currently still working with complexity theory, and I have a project, like I mentioned earlier, with Katie Strom and some other researchers who do work in like sort of posthumanist theoretical frames, on how novice teachers develop into pedagogues and how they develop their pedagogies, and taking that systems-based lens really helps us to understand the multiple variables that are at play as novice teachers develop their initial understandings of pedagogy. And then I'm also trying to apply that to my own study of the pre-service teachers that I work with here at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I get to witness pre-service teachers taking their final methods course at the university and then transitioning into student teaching. And I focus on an anti-bias pedagogical approach in that methods course. So I'm kind of using this theory to sort of understand how they are bringing that approach into their student teaching context and what the influences are with that transition. And then sorry, I'm just taking my notes here. Um, I think that's it. I'm really curious. I mean, you all might have questions, and I'd be so happy to answer them and discuss them. But I also know that there's folks in the room who do very different types of research than I do, and I am really curious to learn from others and hear from others about if anyone else has used complexity theory in a similar way for data analysis, or if they have other ideas about qualitative data coding programs that might work with this sort of theory, or what it would look like to code data in your area of research. I'm very specifically not a quantitative researcher, so I'm curious if there's a way that it might be applicable in quantitative research or in other types of qualitative research. Um, and then again, if you have any other just like general questions about my projects, I'm happy to share. I'm going to take my slides down so we can not be looking at them in a second, but my email is there. And then, like I said, I've just got all these references here. If this is helpful to you, um, yeah, feel free to look at these slides. I got the link in the chat there. Um, but I'll stop there, and I'll leave these, just these questions to the group.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think your work is so powerful in that it clearly demonstrates how qualitative analysis sheds so much light on real lived experiences taking place in complex systems. I really appreciate your work, and I think we will be able to receive questions before we end our session.
Cool. Great. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, if anyone has any general questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I'm also curious to hear about your own research. Oh, Rebecca, do you have a question?
Hi, Dr. Ervin. Thank you so
Hey,
much.
good to see you, Rebecca.
Good to see you too. I was curious about when you talked about like teachers that are committed to justice and equity. How did you how did you bound that term or like how did you define that? And then like how did you identify teachers with those commitments and like how did that affect your like sampling and that kind of thing? Can you share a little bit about that?
For sure. That was such a complicated process in and of itself. Maybe a complex process, I should say, because like I feel like understandings of what, equity even means or justice or social justice, they're such loosely used terms. And they're, I mean, in some ways, someone might be understanding equity in a way that is actually enacting what someone else feels is inequity, right? Like there's just like absolute so much room there for conflict in how people understand those concepts. I personally approached this by first sort of delineating how I was understanding equity, how I was understanding culturally responsive, how I was understanding culturally sustaining, culturally relevant, and the distinctions between those types of pedagogies. I did a lot of research in that space first to sort of I would say like maybe solidify my own understandings. And then when I was recruiting participants, I had pretty long conversations with them on the phone before I even invited them to participate in the study. I think I had like 45 phone conversations with teachers in Georgia to try to find teachers who I thought would be a good fit in the sense that their understandings of either culturally responsive pedagogy or justice or equity were somewhat in line with mine. And so it was a lot of questions, and I put it in my call for participants. It did say like I am recruiting specifically for educators who would name their work as culturally responsive or justice oriented or equity oriented in some way. So that was an underlying criteria for the conversations. And then as we would talk through their work, I kind of asked them about that question, sometimes directly, like kind of like, talk to me about when you think about the term culturally responsive, what do you think that means? Or when you hear about the term equity, like talk to me a little bit about how what that means to you as an educator. And sometimes even those questions wouldn't quite get us there. We would kind of maybe talk around the issue a little bit. And so then I would ask questions like, well, what are some of the books that you're teaching, or what are some of the topics that come up in your classroom? And talk to me about why you chose those books and why do you think it's important for students to get into that topic? And what is your bigger goal with that lesson? Um,
Cool.
and so we would go through that whole conversation. The one thing that became kind of awkward or a little bit difficult is if teachers did not bring up equity or justice in a way that I felt really aligned with my own understanding or felt was going to be really productive. Trying to come up with a kind excuse for not recruiting them,
Right.
but a lot of times I was able to just kind of say like, oh, I'm really particularly choosing teachers from this grade level, and I already have a
Yeah.
sixth grade teacher, or I already have a teacher in this kind of a district context. So I really appreciate your time, and just
Yeah.
kind of leaving it at that. So it definitely wasn't perfect. I will say for sure there were teachers that I worked with that as I got into their classrooms and observed, I started to see that maybe we did have different understandings of what their work was like. And I think there was some signifying work going on there where teachers knew, I'm this university professor, person. I'm also like some of them had graduated from the program that I was teaching at. And so I think there was some work to signify like our teaching program was very equity focused. And I think there was a work to signify like I'm in the classroom and I'm doing the thing that
Yeah.
y'all taught me to do.
Yeah.
And I had to dig through a lot of that. And I really, I ultimately, respect the work that these teachers are doing, and I certainly don't mean to criticize it because they're doing incredible things. But I did have to really be mindful of how we were understanding those terms differently. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's super helpful. Thank you so
yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really um, heartwarming to empathize with you, going with all these data and trying to figure it out, and like doing this arrangement and these sticky notes and like the coloring and like changing the arrangements. The qualitative work is so creative in that way.
Yeah.
So very much empathizing with you
Yeah.
around that. we're doing work that is similar in a way. So we're just finishing 6 years qualitative work with social studies teachers, actually focusing like with your current projects about novice teachers and how they move from the methods
Yeah.
course to the classroom, and taking a complexity systems perspective on that.
Oh,
So
cool.
we would love to connect.
Yes.
And we have our approach. You asked about analytical approaches
Yeah.
for qualitative data. So we're very, very happy to collaborate and talk to you about this. One question that I
Great.
have that we are encountering, particularly working with inquiry narrative methods, is the status of the data, the ontological and epistemological status of the data, and what inferences we can make from an interview.
Right.
So part of what, part of my interpretation is what your analysis of the nested systems is, from just bounding it in the narrative data, is actually the construction of the teacher.
Right.
Rather than an ontological verified thing that happened outside, right?
Right.
So part of it is like, how do we, and so perhaps what the data, when we're doing interviews, what we get is not necessarily the ability to say anything about the world outside of the actual system within which the teachers reside, but it's a sort of like the nature, and you're an English or a language and literature person.
Yep.
What we get is a cultural scaffold or a cultural representation of the way people make narratives.
Yeah.
And what you get is not necessarily the influences, but the personal meaning making of their own current state. Because what you also get is like you get a snapshot with the interview, a snapshot of their identity system, basically at the point of the interview. And as you inferred, from the identity of an interviewee who is speaking to, and this is where qualitative research also can inform us a lot, right? So they're telling the story in the moment to you in the situation of being interviewed.
Right.
And maybe if they would be speaking to a parent, they would speak and construct a different narrative, and the systems would look different. And so just negotiating that, and what kind of other data might we want in order to be able to say, actually, well, their meaning making is actually happening, and what they talked about, the support from the administrators, actually, that's what the administrators also perceive. So, and how, I mean, and, from one sense, the ontological approach can be, well, each of these players in that school system is constructing their own meaning, and each of them is a system, and it's like, the interaction between these meaning systems. So how did you think about that?
I thought, sorry, I didn't mean to jump on here. I thought about that so much, and I had to ask, like, I got so many questions about that from my dissertation committee. And I think there was such a drive, especially then into 2023, to say, but how are teachers influenced by this legislation? And you can't answer that with a narrative inquiry. Like, you just can't. And so I have lots of inferences, and I'm sure I've published my own thoughts on it, but it's all, like you say, it's all my construction, and it's all based on how I'm interpreting this one unique moment that is very specifically designed for me as the audience, as an academic researcher, that, like you say, is drastically different from how they would present their stories or their influences to any other audience. And so, and that was, I think, what was tricky about using both complexity theory and narrative. Like, neither one of those come to concrete answers. It's all about how you're constructing and how you're bounding and how you're, like, your interpretation as a researcher. And yet I really do feel like there's a drive in the context that we're in to, like, understand, our teacher's going to quit if we keep doing this. Our teacher's going to stop teaching these books. Like, what are teachers going to do? And it's like, I do not know. I have no idea. And I can't answer that with the type of research that I do. I don't think anybody can answer it, though. That's what I think is important, is I don't think there's any, I personally, my stance is that there's not a way to determine that. And that's why I like working with these theories, because I think it allows for that sort of ambiguity, but people don't like that. I'll tell you who doesn't like that. Dissertation committees don't like that. So that was a lot of fun to be doing that study with. Fortunately, everyone on my committee, well, two out of the three on my committee were other qualitative researchers. I did have a mixed methods person on there, but yeah, it was a lot of trying to like get at this sense of like we're just here to talk about what I'm seeing, and this is very much coming from my perspective. This is not even, I wouldn't even make the claim that I am accurately interpreting this, but I'll tell you all the steps that I'm taking to try to accurately interpret it. But this is my interpretation. This is not what the teacher, like this is not necessarily accurate, but it's certainly not generalizable in any sense. I certainly would make the claim, any kind of claim about validity, like those are just not really concepts that we really get into a narrative inquiry, and because everything is so context dependent. And I think that's why complexity theory talks really well with narrative inquiry, because it is so much about that interpretation and that sort of ontological stance of being comfortable not knowing, you know. But I did want to say one thing that I did try to do that I felt was important, and I'd love to hear more and connect more about your work with social studies teachers, because I do feel like that's another field where I'm just so curious about how teachers are experiencing their work right now, given everything that's going on. I did feel that it was really necessary for me to connect with these teachers over the semester that we were working together. And if anything, I would have loved to work with them for a year or 2 years. Like I feel like the length of time was really mattered, because I think what I noticed, and this is something that I actually wrote about pretty recently, is I noticed that the way that they talked about their work in our first interview together actually drastically changed from the way that they talked about it in our last interview together. And that there were, and especially, just all these little moments in between where we were working to build our relationship up. But in that last interview, that was really where they were a lot more open about the challenges that they were experiencing and the personal emotions that they were feeling. And some of what I felt like were my most important interpretive conclusions came from those final interviews. And I just feel like it took that time, it took those repeated moments of interaction to get past some of that signifying work that I was talking about earlier, and some of that this is a momentary thing versus actually, no, this is kind of developed from the first interview onward. And now that we're here, I think I really have a better understanding of what you're saying and where you're coming from. And again, I still can't make the claim that it's totally accurate. It's still my interpretation, but I do think that having, some of these teachers I only had 3 interviews with, but some of them I had like 6 interviews with. Some of them I was able to get in their classrooms and do observations in there. And I think just that time with them helped a lot in terms of moving towards this concept of maybe being able to claim that I have some sort of objective understanding of their experiences. But I definitely think that yeah, at some point, I just don't think it's possible for us to fully understand what any individual teacher is living through with the way that their work is being imbued with all these different political understandings right now. Um, and I just feel like that's something that I have to be okay with and keep sort of still arguing that the work still matters. But yeah.
I have a similar question along the same lines as Avi. So we know that the lens we adopt during a study shapes the types of questions we ask and what we pay attention to and what we see as researchers. So I have not read your work, but I sure will. How did you address the author's positionality in your study? Did you talk about your ontological, epistemological assumptions? How did you position yourself as the researcher?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my question.
Do you mean like in the way that I wrote about it, or in the way that I talked with participants, or both?
Did you talk about yourself in the paper? Because these are the experiences filtered through
For
your
sure.
position,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I sure did. I talked about myself quite a bit, probably too much, but I did talk about myself in the publications that I've written because I do think that that is such a necessary part of it. And I think, in qualitative research, we've seen this movement towards establishing the researcher positionality. I think a lot of that is still a lot of that signifying work, like I'm a white cisgender woman, like some of it gets kind of like you're just sort of checking the boxes and naming your positionalities. And I think what's more important to do, especially in work like this, is to say, here is my own history of experience that has led me to even care about this question at all. Like, here's why why this even matters to me. And that's what I try, or I hope I convey in my writing, is that I'm really trying to name, like, for me, it's my personal history with teaching and the own complicated, nature and sort of the conflicts that I experienced in my own teaching and how those were impacted by policies in the school that I was in, and then how those conflicted with some of my personal goals for teaching. So I talk about that, I would say, borderline extensively, especially in the dissertation where I had so much room to just do whatever I wanted. I have to manage that a little more carefully when I'm writing for publication. You only get 8,000 words or whatever. But I do try to write about my own teaching history and how it brought me to this question. And then I also talk about it with the participants, and this is in line with narrative inquiry, but it's about building a relationship, it's about building trust, it's about sharing stories. And so when we're doing, interviews, a lot of it really is more of a conversation back and forth. And as they're telling me this one story that they had in the classroom, I'm telling them, oh yeah, that reminds me of a time when I did this and this and this. And it's a lot more of a back and forth rather than an interviewer asking necessarily a question and answer. And I think that you have to come into it being willing to share yourself and your own perspective and being really open. There's not that same, some research paradigms would kind of argue that the researcher should remain really objective and not share their underlying goals. That's not narrative inquiry does not agree with that. Narrative inquiry is more like you are very open about your goals, you're very open about where you're coming from and why you're interested in this topic, and you have a conversation about it. And so I try to explain that in when I publish about this, I try to explain both that approach to interviewing and narrative inquiry, and then also my own history of like why I care about the question and why it matters to me. And so necessarily I'm interpreting it through this lens. And I try to name how I'm understanding these complicated concepts of justice and equity to get to Rebecca's question earlier, because that's really important too, is how I even conceive of that kind of work.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Dr. Jennifer Ervin for her rich presentation.
Thanks.
We
Thanks
have
for having
one.
me. Sorry. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining. We have one quick SIG announcement. Please join us at AERA. You can find our AERA SIG program on the screen. And we are also planning a social with our community right after our business meeting. You can find the RSVP form in the chat. And please follow us on our social media channels to stay updated. Thank you for joining us today. In case you missed last month's letter, we have provided a link in the chat, and make sure to keep an eye out for April's newsletter so you can stay up to date on all of the SIG's offerings. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was great to see you all.
Thank you.